if you have your Bible, and as David Platt says, I hope you do, please go ahead and get it out. I feel like, Bryn, this Bible reading stuff is much better if you have the Britney Spears mic, so you can have both hands available. We're going to have to look into getting one of those. Mark, I want to talk about the background of the book of Mark, who he was, and kind of put in perspective, what are the Gospels? Because if you read the Bible, and that's a very small percentage of Christians anyway, a lot of times, even if you read it, you can get what Jesus says, but it's interesting and it's probably advantageous to also have an idea of where these Gospels came from and how they got there, who were these people that wrote them, why did they write them, and all these questions. I find it interesting, and I do think that it's advantageous to have a little bit of knowledge. I don't think it's necessary for salvation, but Peter did say, be able to defend your faith, be able to have a reason for the hope that's in you. And the more you can explain to those who doubt and who are skeptical, I think it's better. And so I want to talk about what the book of Mark is, and who Mark is, and just the whole background. We'll see how far we get, whether we actually get into the book of Mark or not. Mark was a co-worker of Paul and a disciple of Peter. Now, I'm going to say that, and I don't want you just to assume, again, I want us to train here. Even with me, I'm going to be fumbling around up here. But when I say that Mark, and his name is John Mark, okay, John Mark, and I believe John was, I'm trying to remember, I have it here somewhere. I think one of the names was the Hebrew name, one of the names was his other name, but it's John Mark is the actual name of Mark. He was a co-worker of Paul, and you don't just believe me. I want you to turn to your Bibles. I know we're in Mark, but turn to Colossians that Paul wrote, Colossians 4:10. And I will be slower than you, so take your time and don't get worried if you don't find it at first. Colossians 4:10. There we go. Okay, and if you're there, Colossians 4:10, this is Paul writing, and what he says, my fellow prisoner, Aristarchus sends you his greeting, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. That's Mark. That's Mark who wrote the book of Mark. That's who he's talking about. He was a co-worker of Paul. He was also a disciple of Peter. Turn to 1 Peter 5:13. 1 Peter 5:13. I told you I'd be slower than y'all. All right, 1 Peter 5:13. And what that says is, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends her greetings, and so does my son Mark. Greet one another with a kiss of love. Now, my son Mark doesn't mean it's his son, it's his spiritual son, which means that Peter was probably the mentor of John Mark. John Mark was the disciple of Peter and would have spent a lot of time with Peter, which is why and how he wrote the Gospel of Mark. Mark did not follow Jesus. Mark was not around Jesus. Mark was not with the disciples when he was with Jesus. I don't know if you already know this or not, but this is interesting stuff. I think it's very interesting. Mark gets his stories primarily about Jesus, what Jesus did, through Peter and through the oral tradition that they would have back then. The primary tradition of telling the stories would have been oral. They would have talked about what Jesus did, what Jesus said. In fact, John Mark was probably a young teenager at the time that the disciples were with Jesus during that 3-year period of ministry. Interestingly, if you turn now, I told you, we're all about the Bible now, which I love. I just wish I could be faster. Turn to Acts 12:12. Remember the story in Acts when Peter gets imprisoned by Herod, and he's in prison. They're basically arresting all the Christians. He's in prison, and an angel appears, and all of a sudden he's loose. And the disciples had been praying for him. It said that the disciples had not failed to pray for Peter while he was in prison. Peter escapes from jail, and this is where he goes. That's where we pick up in Acts 12:12. It says, Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen." And now we get into 12. When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance and came in. That's John Mark. That's John Mark's mother. That's where Peter ran. That's where the church would meet at least once, if not more than once, during this time period. John Mark was a witness to all these subsequent events that happened. He knew Peter back when he was a teenager. Peter took him under his wing, and he was a disciple of Peter and a co-worker of Paul. Now, why did Mark write it? Because it was mainly oral tradition, and people wanted a written record of what Jesus said. And so Mark wrote the book of Mark. Now, this is really, again, I think it's interesting, but it's nerdy stuff. Originally, the thought was, it's called the Augustinian hypothesis, which is what people believed up until I think about 150, 200 years ago, was that the Gospel of Matthew was the first to be written. Mark used Matthew in the writing of his, and Luke followed both Matthew and Mark. Gospel of John is different than all the other ones. The first three are called the Synoptic Gospels because they're very similar and they kind of track along with each other. John's just completely different. But they believed that the Gospel of Matthew was first. Mark used Matthew kind of as a roadmap, and Luke came later. That has been debunked by most scholars. Most scholars believe now, and I think it's the Markan priority, that Mark was first. Mark is the oldest gospel that we have, written around AD 65 to 70. That's when it would have been written. And it's the first one, and not only is it the first one written, but they believe now, the majority of scholars believe that Matthew and Luke were actually modeled off of the Gospel of Mark. Like, that was sort of the roadmap that they used to write their gospel. Obviously, they added additional information that, especially with Matthew, that he would have personally seen when he was with Jesus. But that's the belief now. Mark was first. It's the oldest gospel that we have. More nerdy stuff. They believe, I think it's a plurality, a majority of scholars believe there is also, had to be, they think, a missing book that we do not have called Q. They call it Q. And Q was basically something that would just have been the sayings of Jesus. And basically, these, we've got these disciples following Jesus around. I think when people read the Bible, they think that the disciples were like writing down everything he said, and when they got done, Jesus died, they had a book ready and it was published. That's not how it worked. It was mostly oral tradition, but most people believe the disciples, at least Matthew, who was a tax collector and who would have known shorthand and who would have known about taking notes and keeping records, would have made notes as they were going, because Jesus was teaching things that people needed to follow, and so some of it would have been written down. So they believe there were notes taken by the disciples as everything was happening, and that these notes probably ended up in what they're calling Q, a hypothetical document of all of Jesus' sayings. Not a narrative, not what happened, not conversations, but things Jesus said. Truly I tell you, all the sayings of Jesus. Q. The belief is that Mark was the first, basically Matthew and Luke. It's called the two-source hypothesis. And it proposes, this is what most people believe, the Gospel of Matthew and Luke were written independently, they didn't conspire with each other, written separately using two sources other than their own knowledge, those sources being the book of Mark and Q, the sayings of Jesus, maybe to help them remember exactly what Jesus said that had already been written down and compiled as it was happening. The book of Q has never been found, but again, scholars are in agreement that a majority of them think that there is a book of Q that we just haven't found that's been lost of Jesus' sayings, and that's how Matthew and Luke came about. But Mark was the original framework, the original gospel, the first one in AD 65 to 70. And I know this can be boring, but this is interesting to me, and maybe you're the same kind of nerd. Right, so that's what the book of Mark is. That's who Mark is. It's also important when you look at a gospel, any of the gospels, to see who is that gospel aimed at, because the gospels are aimed at different audiences based on who it was that wrote it. Matthew writes his gospel to the Jewish people, and Mark doesn't. Mark is in a Roman culture. They think this book was written to the church in Rome, which is where Mark was, and Romans. They didn't need to know the genealogies that the Jewish people would have wanted to hear, to know that Jesus was in fact traced back to the clan of Judah, the tribe of Judah. They didn't need to know that. It didn't matter to them. They didn't even know what that meant. So that's not in there. You'll see the book of Mark is incredibly muscular, short, and to the point. And it's got none of that stuff that Matthew has. It doesn't have any of the prophecies fulfilled that Matthew has. Matthew makes it a point to talk about each of the Old Testament prophecies that foretold of the coming of Jesus, and then showing that Jesus was in fact the fulfillment of those prophecies, because the Jewish people who knew the law, who knew the Torah, that would have been important. If you're convincing them that this Jesus is in fact the Messiah, they want to see the Old Testament prophecies and compare what Jesus did to what those prophecies said. That wasn't Mark's intention. He didn't need to do that. Romans, who were mostly Gentiles, had no knowledge, did not care about the Old Testament prophecies. It would not have made any sense to them. It would not have made it any more compelling. And so Mark includes none of that. It's muscular, it's short, it's to the point. It's much like the Roman culture back then. It was designed to reach this kind of people. And so all that stuff's out. In fact, it is the shortest gospel account because his audience isn't Jews. He doesn't have to have a lot of the things Matthew had to have. Some of the things missing from Mark, just to push down on that, are the discourses you find, the conversations you find in Matthew, the details you find in Luke, the proofs of divinity that are all over John. All that's not in Mark. I think it was on the video. I think I heard it, but the main point that Mark makes, and you saw in the video. Peter once said, you're the Messiah. The book starts out, I think let's turn to Mark real quick. Turn to Mark 1. Okay, Mark 1, this is the very, very first sentence. I mean, Mark gets to the point. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. The very first sentence, Mark, as the video said, describes Jesus as the Son of God. At the very end, a Roman soldier seeing Jesus die on the cross describes Jesus as the Son of God. In the middle, everyone is confused and nobody gets it, because everybody is expecting a different kind of Messiah. All the Jewish people were expecting a Messiah to ride in with an army and overthrow the Roman establishment, which had basically made them slaves, had taken over their territory. That's what they had pictured. And Mark makes it a point to show the confusion about that. None of the disciples got it. Even when Peter said, "You're the Messiah," he didn't mean you're the Messiah, because he was thinking of a different kind of Messiah. And in fact, Peter later in the same book goes on to deny Jesus 3 times. So in the beginning, Mark says he's the Son of God. At the end, a Roman Gentile soldier says this must be the Son of God. In the middle, nothing but confusion because they were expecting a different kind of Messiah. Mark is pointing out this particular Jesus. There's different perspectives and attributes and angles to look at Jesus. John, it's the divinity of Jesus. Mark is the suffering servant that Jesus was. He's not the Messiah you were expecting. He's the suffering servant of Isaiah 52 and 53. Let's hop back real quick to Isaiah 52 and 53. That's the Old Testament. You're going to go back. It's after Psalms and Proverbs. Isaiah 52, the end of Isaiah 52 and the beginning of Isaiah 53. How many years do you think this was before Jesus, Gary? 700 years? All right. Isaiah 52, and it's where's it at? Verse 13. Isaiah 52, verse 13. This is 700 or so years before Jesus was even born. And this is what the prophet Isaiah prophesies. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being. That's why we showed those videos this morning. It wasn't just happen chance. I'm talking about Jesus here. Jesus being beaten beyond recognition before being put on that cross. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. So he will sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Then Isaiah 53 goes on to say, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot. Again, talking about Jesus, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind. A man of suffering, familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. And that makes me picture when the people that this is talking about, we, the people, had the chance to let Jesus, the God, the creator of all things, go, or to release a murderer named Barabbas. I want to say Barnabas. It's not Barnabas. Barabbas. Actually, it's Barabbas. Barabbas, or Barabbas Jesus was his name, ironically enough. Yeah. So this is what it's saying when it says, because you may be like, well, he wasn't despised. He was. He was despised. He was murdered by his own people. They let a murderer go instead of this man who healed people for 3 years and spoke love. He was despised. We held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each one of us has turned our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of this generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied by his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. That is, the fact that was written 700 years before this came to pass gives me chills. I don't need much more proof than just reading that right there. Even if Jesus, who would have been versed in Old Testament law and the prophets, would have known this, you still could not reenact all those things. And who would? Who would want to? And so for the skeptics and the naysayers that say, well, he would have known Isaiah and he just acted it out, what's worth that? I don't think he could have. There's things in there that fell into place that he could not control. He is God. He is the Isaiah 53 suffering servant, which is what Mark makes pains to point out because the disciples just didn't get it. And ironically, a Roman soldier, a Gentile, was the first other than Mark in the beginning to see it at the end. The main verse, and I don't even have it, but of Mark, if you wanted to pick one out, was where it said that Jesus came to serve and not be served. And obviously, as his people, we are no better than he is, and that should be our mission. What is it? 10:45. Let me turn there real quick. Mark 10:45. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Talking about they lord that position. They lord that authority. They lord that, title over them. You probably have bosses like that. And their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Not so with me. Not so with Eddie. Not so with Gary. Not so with Lisa. Not so with us. We follow Jesus. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man, even God, Emmanuel, God among us, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many, which we just expounded upon in Isaiah 53. That's all I have about Mark, just kind of introducing it. I think we'll wait until next Sunday and we'll start Mark 1 then. What does that mean though? Let's make this Bible study time and let's just open it up. What does it mean? If Jesus, who we claim to serve and who was God, came to serve and not to be served? Think about your life right now. Think about the relationships you're in. Think about some of the conflict that you're currently having. You got that? I mean, everybody's probably having some kind of conflict with somebody, even if it's not major. Just think about that relationship in your life where everything isn't exactly smooth. Think about how that statement, for the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve, and you should as well. That you should serve and not be served. Your whole purpose, we already talked about it, is to do good works. You're saved to good works, to serve. This all fits together. It meshes. What does that mean in terms of that conflict and that relationship that you're currently having? And if you really acted that out, and you really said, you know what, I'm here to serve, not be served. I'm here to give, not take. I'm here to encourage and not get my feelings hurt because I'm not being encouraged. If you applied that to that one thing in your head right now, that relationship that has conflict, if you, first of all, ask yourself, are you? And you're probably not. I'm not. But if you did, what would that look like? You don't have to worry about how it would change things. Results are in God's hands. But if you changed how you acted to be more like the servant suffering Savior, what would you have to do differently? Do you need to make a telephone call? Do you need to tell somebody, hey, look, I'm sorry about that? So you don't have to apologize for things that aren't wrong, but you can still step past them. I don't know what was. I know we got into a conflict, and I'm sorry about whatever I may have done wrong. I just want to love on you. I want to encourage you. I'm here for you. I'm not against you. How can we get over this hump? What can I do? Do you understand? Like, you can do those things. And I mean, that's what Jesus is calling us to. He's calling us to kill our pride. Because so much in life we're thinking about, ourselves. I do it all the time. I mean, constantly. It's about me. If there's a low turnout at church, I'm worried. I'm not worried about where people are and are they struggling. I'm worried about the church I have. There's not a lot of people. It might be embarrassing. It means they don't like me. These things go through your head. No one's perfect. Everyone struggles with pride and thinking of themselves as number one and everybody else a distant second. And if we could flip that, which is what Jesus says. Look, when Jesus got down on his knees and washed the disciples' feet, that was a clarion call that we are not to be putting ourselves first, that we are to serve each other first and foremost, and that we are to be a distant second, third, and fourth to everyone else around us. And the beauty of that is if everybody lived like that, this community would be unbelievable. Because I may not be thinking about myself as number one, but you would be. You would be. It'd be nothing but love. It'd be a love like we've never seen before. That's the kingdom of God, which, as we said, Jesus is ushering in now, not later. It's beginning now, once we start acting the way he has called us to act and being the way he's called us to be. Anybody got an idea? Anybody want to open up and give an example of, not to give names, but like something you're going through right now and where you're like, okay, if I really applied this, I think it would change everything. I know you all probably have an idea. Anything pop into your head? Huh? Yeah, well, come here. Come up here and just kind of explain it. I went short on time, I'm sure, so we got some time. Come up here and let's make this like what the old church used to be. Let's talk about Jesus and how he can change our lives.
I don't know where to start. I don't want to get too specific, but this week at work, I felt like the company owed me more than I was getting, and I got all poo-pooed and kind of refused to do my job properly. And my attitude spread. I'm sure everybody around me felt it, and had I not gotten like that, maybe my week would have ended a lot better than it did on Friday, not only for myself, but for everyone else. And I think it got to the point where nobody wanted to talk to me because they was afraid of the way I was going to react. I know one person in specific went to speak to me and kind of said, never mind, and walked away. And I felt bad about that and just let it go and didn't say anything about it to him. And this person means a lot to me, and I should have never let those things manifest themselves on the job or anywhere else for that matter.
Anybody else? That's good. And it reminds me, she listens to a lady, a teacher named Nancy. She spoke on it before, Nancy DeMoss. And I think is it that book or The Excellent Wife? One of those books. It had something very. It hit me. I'm like, okay, wow. A lot of times we get upset with other people because we think our rights are being violated. And I know it sounds backwards in this first world American country where we're all about our rights and, all that stuff. But to realize just for 1 second that you have no rights is freeing. You don't have a right to breathe. You don't have a right to walk. You don't have a right to wake up. Everything is a gift of grace from a God who did not have to give you anything that you have right now. It's all a gift. You have a right to absolutely nothing. And if you can accept that, which is a hard thing to accept, all of a sudden, it's much easier to serve. It's just much easier to give somebody something who others may not think they deserve it, but you're like, well, I'm here for a purpose. My rights aren't being violated. I don't have rights. I can stay up till 2 to take care of somebody because, well, I don't really have a right to sleep. Thank God I get any sleep. You know, God is great. God is precious. God lets me breathe out. If he doesn't breathe out, I don't breathe in. Every single time it happens in a day. Everything is a gift. And our world, I mean, it's, what's it called? Entitlement. That is the lie of Satan. You are entitled to nothing. Everything is grace. Everything's a gift. And it opens up a world when you can do that. I'll give you a little story. And if somebody else has one, please. Where I work at, a lot of our wreck cases are small wreck cases. People get, bumped into in the back or whatever, and they'll go get chiro treatment for, 6 weeks or whatever, and we'll try to get it settled, and they might get, a couple $1,000s. That's most cases. There are some cases where people get seriously injured and they get a lot of money like on the commercials, right? But most cases, it's those garden variety ones. Well, we get folks in all the time, and guess what? Guess why they called our number? Because they saw a commercial. And on the commercial, what did they see? Somebody who got $100,000 or $500,000 or whatever, because obviously we're going to put our best results on TV. Well, they don't know that's our best results. They don't know that person had an arm amputated, and that's why they got so much. They don't know that person had a disc bulge in their back and had back surgery and has medical bills of $200,000, and that's why that settlement's so high. They don't know that. But they think, I'm in a wreck. George Sink gets big money for people. I'm going to call them. And so I get these clients with these garden variety wreck cases, and when it's time to settle, and I call them up and say, hey, it looks like I can put $2,000 in your pocket. A lot of times it makes for a nasty conversation because their expectations were here and the reality was somewhere down here. That being said, sometimes I'll meet with them face to face to explain things. Sometimes they're nasty to me. Now, I could say I have a right not for you not to get nasty with me because I'm not the one offering this money. It's Geico's fault. It's Allstate's fault. It's not me. I'm doing everything I can, and you have no idea about the law, and I've had 16 years of experience, and you need to understand this is just the deal. Don't cuss at me. Don't say those things. Don't act like I'm an idiot. I'm not on your side. And when people like that come in, a lot of times I do not hold my tongue like I should. And I like to call it being frank. I'm a black and white guy. If I adopted the mindset that I'm here to serve and not to be served, if I could look at those people with more love than I do, because I don't look at them with love. I look at them with somebody who has no idea what they're talking about. I'm going to set them straight, and I'm going to take care of business. And I'm a jerk because of it. It's just because they don't know the law, just because they might, not have as much money, come from the other side of the railroad tracks, as people say, or whatever. I mean, I used to live on the other side of the railroad tracks. That's me. I should know better. I should have more compassion. But I don't. You get hardened. You get your rights set. You think you know what you have a right to. If you can understand you got a right to nothing, that you're here to serve, not to be served, I think that would change my conversations with people. I could be more like my supervising attorney. I won't say his name, but he's a Christian. And he can go in there, and they'll say, you did a terrible job, and you're a bad person. And he'll be like, I know. My wife calls me worse. But, I mean, he deflects it, and he's nice. And I'm like, I want to be like that. I know, and it's so hard, but if you read this, it's like we don't have a choice. If you're a Christ follower, this is what you're called to do. And so you have to bite the bullet. You have to stop being... in fact, I'll go as far as to say this, because I know there's other people in this church that suffer with that same mentality as me. Like, when the time's right, we're going to tell it like it is. That's rebellion. Whether you feel justified or not, whether it's at work or a coworker or whatever, it's rebellion. Black and white. It's just rebellion. I think the only time where it wouldn't be rebellion is dealing with false teachers of the law. Jesus had no time for that. I think we can call that stuff out. But in your day-to-day operations, you're here to be a light. You're here to serve, not to be served. You're here to do good works. And there's no room for attitudes and puffing our chest out when we do that. And that's if I could learn what I just said and actually apply it, I'd be a different man. I've been working on it all my life. Anybody got another story they want to share? Conflict in your life, if you just applied this principle, you think it would change it? Yeah? No? Maybe so? All right, let's pray. God, we love you so much. We thank you for this church. We thank you for your word. We thank you for you. We thank you for everything that you've given us, including life and just our relationship with you. It's the biggest gift of all. And we love you. We hope that we're honoring you and your word, and that we are teaching it correctly. And we hope that it's piercing hearts and changing lives. And thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.